There was a time when the name Detroit wasn't just a dot on a map. It was a promise, a rhythm, the very heartbeat of America in the 20th century. In the early 1900s, something remarkable happened. From a city once filled with quiet streets and modest homes, Detroit suddenly roared to life. Ford introduced the Model T in 1908, and the world would never be the same. It wasn't just a car, it was freedom on four wheels. For the first time, the average American family could imagine owning a vehicle of their own, rolling down open roads that stretched farther than dreams ever had before. The assembly line changed everything. Men and women left farms, small towns, and even crossed oceans to work in Detroit's factories. They came with calloused hands and hungry hearts, and the city gave them something solid in return. A paycheck, a sense of pride, and the chance to build a future. Day after day, the shift whistles blew, and thousands poured through the gates of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. Inside the plants, steel met fire, sparks lit the air, and cars rolled off the line by the millions. Outside, families built new lives. A modest house, a yard out front, a Ford or Chevrolet in the driveway. That was the American dream, and in Detroit, it felt real. But Detroit was more than engines and steel. It was a sound, a spirit. From the same streets that built the cars came the smooth voices of Motown, Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye. Their songs drifted through living rooms, onto porches, into cars cruising down Main Street. On Sundays, families gathered around their TVs to watch football, while kids played ball in the yard until the streetlights came on. For a moment in time, Detroit seemed unstoppable. The city wasn't just building cars, it was building lives, culture, and identity. It was building America itself. By the 1950s and 60s, Detroit stood at its height. They called it the Motor City, and the name fit like no other. The factories glowed at night, the highways stretched wide, and the hum of engines became the background music of American life. For working families, the rhythm of life was steady and strong. A father might clock 12 hours on the line, return home with tired hands, and still smile as he parked a shiny new Chevrolet in the driveway. That car wasn't just a machine, it was proof that sacrifice paid off, that tomorrow could be brighter than yesterday. The suburbs grew like fields in spring, rows of homes with white fences, backyard grills, and kids riding bicycles until dusk. Inside, families gathered around their TVs, watching Ed Sullivan or Walter Cronkite, while Motown's sweet sound floated from the radio. The Temptations, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder. Music and machines, both born in Detroit, carried America forward in unison. On Friday nights, teenagers polished chrome bumpers and cruised down Main Street. Radios turned up, songs of hope and love echoing into the night. On Sundays, families loaded up the station wagon for drives along new interstate highways, crossing states with ease that only a generation earlier had seemed impossible. Detroit wasn't just building cars, it was building identity. It was building the American middle class. The pride of a paycheck, a home, a car, and the chance to send kids to college was the golden promise of the Motor City. And for a while, it felt unstoppable. Detroit burned bright, a symbol of power, pride, and possibility. The world looked at the city and saw the future. And that future was rolling on four wheels. Behind the roar of engines and the glow of factory lights, Detroit was a city of people, ordinary men and women who carried extraordinary hope. Workers came from every corner of America, and from across the ocean, too. A young man from Kentucky might leave behind the tobacco fields, step off a train in Detroit, and within a week be tightening bolts on an assembly line. An immigrant from Poland or Italy might trade old country hardship for a steady job that promised something his parents never knew: security. And with that security came dreams fulfilled. Families who once rented crowded apartments now owned tidy homes with front porches and backyard swings. Mothers hung laundry on the line while children played catch in the street. Fathers sat at the kitchen table, tired but proud, knowing their work at the plant had put food on the plate and a roof overhead. Detroit became the beating heart of the American middle class. It wasn't just about wages, it was about dignity. A car in the driveway, a television in the living room, Motown on the radio, football on Sunday afternoons. It was life made tangible, the American dream within reach. But even in those golden years, shadows lingered. Factories demanded long hours and dangerous conditions. A single mistake on the line could bring injury, sometimes worse. The city grew fast, and with growth came tension between old neighborhoods and new, between races and classes, between promises made and promises kept. Still, most families pressed forward. They believed in the future. They believed in Detroit. The city was more than a place to live. It was a symbol of progress, of unity, of what America could be when hard work met opportunity. Yet history has its turns, and as the 1960s wore on, cracks began to show. Tensions in the streets, whispers of change in the factories, worries about foreign competition. For the first time, people began to ask a quiet, unsettling question. Could the good times last? Every golden age carries within it the seeds of decline, and for Detroit, those seeds began to sprout in the late 1960s. The first shock came not from the factories, but from the streets. In the summer of 1967, Detroit erupted in days of unrest. Entire blocks burned, businesses crumbled, and trust between neighbors was torn apart. It was one of the darkest chapters in the city's history. When the smoke cleared, Detroit was forever changed. Families who could afford to leave moved to the suburbs, taking with them both wealth and stability. At the same time, forces outside the city were reshaping the auto industry itself. In the 1970s, the world was shaken by oil crises. Gasoline prices soared, and suddenly Detroit's beloved big cars, powerful, stylish, but thirsty, felt like dinosaurs on the road. Americans began turning to smaller, fuel-efficient cars made overseas. Japanese brands, in particular, gained a foothold that Detroit's automakers struggled to resist. Inside the factories, tension grew. Unions fought for workers' rights, higher wages, better benefits, but every contract raised costs. Executives looked for ways to cut corners, sometimes at the expense of innovation. Assembly lines slowed, quality slipped, and American cars developed a reputation they had never carried before: unreliable. The once proud rhythm of Detroit faltered. A city that had pulsed with the roar of engines and the hum of production now began to hear a quieter sound: silence. Factories shuttered. Jobs disappeared. Whole neighborhoods, once full of laughter and music, stood empty. And perhaps most painfully, the city's identity began to fracture. Detroit had been the Motor City, the symbol of American power and possibility. Now that very identity was in question. Could a city built on cars survive when the cars themselves were slipping from the hands of their makers? The 1970s and 1980s marked not just an economic downturn, but a crisis of spirit. People who once believed Detroit could only rise now faced a harsher reality. Decline was not only possible, it was happening. By the late 20th century, Detroit's decline was no longer a whisper, it was a shout echoing through every abandoned street. Factories that once ran day and night now stood silent, their windows shattered and their steel frames rusting under gray skies. The city's population, which had peaked at nearly 2 million in the 1950s, collapsed as families fled in search of jobs and stability elsewhere. Block by block, Detroit became a patchwork of empty houses, boarded storefronts, and overgrown lots where children once played. For those who stayed, life grew harder. Jobs were scarce, schools closed, city services broke down, streetlights failed, and entire neighborhoods were left in darkness. The dream of a suburban home, a shiny Ford in the driveway, and a steady paycheck became memories of another age. And then in 2013, the unthinkable happened. Detroit declared bankruptcy. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. For the world, this was a symbol, a city that had once represented industrial might and the very promise of the American dream was now seen as a fallen giant. But for Detroiters, bankruptcy wasn't just a headline, it was lived reality. Pensioners worried if they would be paid. City workers questioned their future. Residents wondered if their city would ever rise again. Yet even in those darkest days, Detroit's cultural heart never fully died. The soulful sound of Motown still echoed in memory. Jazz clubs still played in corners of the city. Lions fans still cheered for their team year after year, no matter the heartbreak. There was pain, yes, but there was also pride, a stubborn resilience that refused to let the Motor City disappear. Detroit had reached rock bottom, but as history so often shows, when a city or a people falls this far, the only way forward is to ask, what comes next? After bankruptcy, many thought Detroit would simply fade into history, a cautionary tale of industrial decline. But cities, like people, have a way of surprising us. Slowly, quietly, new life began to stir. Artists moved into abandoned buildings, painting murals across crumbling walls. Small businesses opened in forgotten neighborhoods, serving coffee, music, and hope. The once deserted downtown saw lights flicker on again, restaurants fill with voices, and old theaters breathe back into life. Automakers, too, found ways to adapt. Electric vehicles, innovation, and fresh investment turned Detroit into not just the motor city of the past, but a testing ground for the future of mobility. It was as if the city that had once put America on wheels was determined to reinvent the wheel itself. But beyond economics, Detroit's revival was about spirit. The same grit that had built the Model T, endured the Depression, fought through wartime production, and danced to Motown rhythms now carried its people forward. Residents, old and young, spoke of pride, not blind nostalgia, but a belief that Detroit still mattered, that its story was not finished. And when you walk its streets today, you can feel that spirit. You see it in the restored facades of old skyscrapers, in the energy of music festivals, in the cheers echoing from sports arenas. Detroit may not be the same city it was in its golden age, but perhaps that's the point. Its story is one of transformation, of loss and rebirth, of reminding America that prosperity is never guaranteed, but resilience is always possible. In many ways, Detroit is still the heartbeat of the American story. Imperfect, scarred, but stubbornly alive. Detroit's story is not just about cars, factories, or even a single city. It is about the very fabric of America. The dream that hard work could lift families, that communities could thrive, that music, culture, and industry could shape a nation. In its golden age, Detroit embodied everything people believed about the American dream.
A factory worker could own a home, raise children, and buy the very car they built with their own hands. Neighborhoods were filled with laughter, radios played Motown hits, and life carried a rhythm of optimism. But dreams are fragile. When industries falter, when leaders fail to adapt, when division overshadows unity, even the mightiest city can fall. Detroit's decline was painful, not only for those who lived it, but for an entire country that watched its heartland struggle. And yet, Detroit did not vanish. It stumbled, it broke, but it endured. Today, the city stands as a reminder. The American dream is not a guarantee, but a pursuit. It requires reinvention, resilience, and hope, even in the darkest hours. For older generations, the story of Detroit may stir memories of first cars, first homes, and first dances to Motown melodies. For younger ones, it is a lesson. Prosperity must be nurtured, cherished, and never taken for granted. In the end, Detroit remains more than a city on a map. It is a symbol, a testament to both the heights and the hardships of American life. And like the engines it once produced by the millions, Detroit's story keeps running, carrying with it the echoes of the past and the promise of tomorrow.